Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining today's virtual forum event hosted by the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy, known to many of you as GU Politics. My name is Christina Cola, and I'm an Executive Master in Policy Leadership student at the McCourt School of Public Policy. During my short time here at Georgetown, I've joined the student strategy team with Mary Catherine Ham, as well as taken advantage of various groups and meetings offered to our students. I'm pleased to announce our panelists for today's conversation on election 2020, What Might Happen. Jessica Taylor is the Senate and Governor's Editor for the Cook Political Report. Scott Tranter is the CEO and founder of Optimus Analytics. And Josh Mendelson is the CEO of Hawkfish. Please join the conversation on social media using the hashtag GU Virtual Forum and by tagging GU Politics at GU Politics. Today's event will be moderated by GU Politics Executive Director, Mo Elliothy, who is going to kick us off. Mo?
Christina, thanks so much for the introduction, Christina, and for your participation and leadership in GU Politics. Looking forward to, whenever it is back on campus, to having you join us at one of our events then. And thanks to all of you who are tuning in tonight, whether it's here in the Zoom, members of the Georgetown community, or the broader public who are tuning in via our live stream online. I'm excited to welcome you all to this incredibly timely conversation. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to start leading a conversation with our panelists about what might happen in a couple of weeks' time. We're going to start the conversation amongst ourselves for the first about half of our time together, and then we'll open it up to members of the Georgetown community to ask your questions. If you have a question to ask, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A tab. Click on that, enter your question. At some point, someone from our team will let you know via the chat that you've been selected, and they'll let you know when we're ready for your question, at which point we'll put you on screen so you can ask your question directly. So make sure you are TV ready, as we often like to say. And you can feel free to start submitting your questions at any point during the program. And so with that, I spent 20 years in politics working on campaigns, and every election cycle, we always said this is an unprecedented election. This one really is an unprecedented election. For lots of different reasons, not the least of which is we're actually trying to do this in the middle of a pandemic. And so there's lots of people who are out there trying to follow the polling, trying to understand what the various scenarios are. Everyone's kind of reading what the election forecasters are saying and reading as much analysis as they can. So we thought we'd actually bring several of these leading forecasters and analysts together to help kind of explain how they analyze the race in real time, as well as maybe give us their best sense as to what the different plausible scenarios are for election night 2020. And so with that, I'm going to open it up with just a basic question I'd love for each of you to take a turn answering. And that is, what do you look like? What do you look at when you are trying to figure out your analysis at the various points between now and election day? What is the data you're synthesizing? How do you synthesize it? How do people do forecasting? Maybe just sort of top line, baseline explanation there. And why don't we start with Scott to kick us off?
Sure. No, thanks for having me, and happy to speak to the Georgetown community. I think the best thing, having done this for several cycles now, is, we always say we like to look at trends, but from a forecaster's point of view, this is, presidential elections every 4 years. So that's not a lot of data points to look at from trend wise. And so it's a wide view of everything from absentee balloting to public polling to private polling. The FEC reports happen to be a big source of information for me and my team and our modeling, especially where money is spent, because you can infer quite a bit from that. But what I would say is keep the data points wide, as well as realize that we're still early on in the forecasting process. Like in 2016, everyone was saying things like, we've never elected a president with, an upside down approval rating. And here we are, 2016, President Trump with an upside down approval rating. We've never elected a president with an incumbent president with a fundraising deficit. We may or may not see that in a couple of weeks, an incumbent president with a fundraising deficit win. So there's a lot of surprise out there. And so, keep an eye, look at a bunch of different data points, keep an eye on the trends, but keep your mind open for a lot of different possibilities is the way I would put it. Uncertainty is your friend when you're an election forecaster.
Josh, maybe you can build on that a little bit more as to how you look at the data, but I'm also curious, Scott talked about the model, right? Modeling. And a lot of that is sort of your best guess, right? When you build a model for what the campaign might look like. As someone who's advised a lot of campaigns, as Scott has, talk about that as well.
It's interesting for me because Hawkfish really takes a digital media approach. So in many ways, what Hawkfish tries to bring to politics is something not so dissimilar from how e-commerce is conducted online. How do you understand your consumer and their needs and desires and wants, and then help them execute on a product? And so therefore, and ultimately purchase that product. And so therefore, with that framing, we're always thinking not so much about forecasting. And so I cringe at that word. It's scenarios. What are the scenarios that will yield likely actions? And in this case, a desired action, a vote cast on behalf of a given candidate. And so when you're building those models, we love composites with a bunch of information. Scott alluded to much of it, whether it's polling or objective data you see in the heuristics. There's obviously the self-reported data. That would be what you find in polling. Obviously, multimodal is what folks are using this cycle. So it's moving from, hey, let's call a bunch of prospective voters on the voter file and ask them questions, and then take their demographics and expand beyond that, through to let's recognize that not that many people answer their landline phones anymore, and you've got to get them via text message, or you've got to encounter them through some other medium. Integrate that in as a piece of learning, but then constantly ground truth it. That's a term we love. You can tell a bunch of us come out of the commercial world because we're constantly wondering, well, what's the ground truth to prove that some of these assumptions might actually be tracking correctly, knowing full well that that end thing that you're all about modeling, that behavior in the voter booth, is something you'll never know with absolute certainty, right? You're taking historic records, you're using that. For us, we like taking observed behaviors, adding those in as well. And then you're building those composite models. You're looking at support, you're looking at likelihood to turnout, and then anything synthetic that kind of combines those two that lets you then understand. So in our case, who to spend those limited ad dollars on to help them understand the way in which they should engage with voting, how to vote easily, where to vote, and then get the vote done, and then not spend another dollar on them if you can avoid it.
Jessica, I'll let you build on what both Josh and Scott talked about, but I'm very curious, as you were looking at the Senate landscape as well, how you approach this. We always say a presidential campaign is not a national campaign. It's a bunch of statewide campaigns, but one constant are the candidates, right? I mean, no matter what state you're looking at when you're modeling out a presidential campaign, still the same candidates. That's not the case when you're modeling out a Senate race, right? There's a lot more data, when you're modeling out sort of the broader Senate landscape, there's a lot of candidates, a lot of different factors. Maybe talk about that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, we at the Political Report, we take sort of a quantitative and a qualitative look at these. We're not just, modeling with the data, and it's sort of, shoe leather reporting that we still do too. So, I mean, we interview candidates, we talk with, their pollsters and strategists. Mo, when you were still working in politics, I know you would get calls from us, and so we want to know what they are seeing too. And, a lot of times when we get pushback for moving a rating or something, it's like, well, the public data says this. We're not just looking at public data. We're looking at private data that we get to see a lot of, that gives us the trends of where things are moving. So, and sometimes it's not just the, head-to-heads that we're looking at, where are the fave-unfaves of the candidate. For instance, one Senate move that I recently made that made a lot of waves was I moved the South Carolina Senate race to toss-up. I went to college there in South Carolina. I would never have expected this race to end up in toss-up, but when you're looking at a candidate like Lindsey Graham, where there's a 10-point gap and where voters trust him, that shows that there is some opportunity there. So you do kind of have to look at these individual races and where things are. And then I'm looking into account, money too. Follow the money. Where are these national groups spending in these last few weeks? So the biggest spending that we have seen when I've looked at the ads in the past 2 weeks, North Carolina and Iowa still remain the two biggest states that candidate and super PACs combined are spending in. That tells you those are the tipping point states that I think Democrats lose Alabama, but they're likely to flip Colorado, Arizona, and Maine. That leaves them one short of a majority. And so North Carolina, despite some of the controversies there with Cal Cunningham and his sexting scandal, Iowa and North Carolina still remain those most likely tipping point states. And then just the sheer size that Democrats have been able to expand the map. And some of it, while I think there is still, you've got to have candidates in place and they've got to be getting good campaigns. Some of this, I think, is partly nationalized, though, where you have candidates that I would even say are, kind of BC level candidates in a way. But if they get swept in a wave election year, you see these races becoming more competitive. They're getting money to put these on the board. We saw such just a wave of donations flow in after the Supreme Court vacancy and things. And then the numbers that we saw, particularly after that first presidential debate and then President Trump getting COVID. I was talking with Republican pollsters that were, about ready to light their hair on fire in that following week because they weren't just seeing President Trump's numbers drop. They were seeing that affect down ballot. So I think when you have something like the Senate races that are tied to the presidential race still, many of these, overlap. Arizona, Georgia, Iowa are also presidential battlegrounds as well. But I think it's these Republican senators that have not really distanced themselves from President Trump in any meaningful way. And even though some of them are starting to do that in sort of these, final 15 days, I'm not sure that it's enough. And so we're not seeing a market shift yet. And this check and balance argument is one that I'm looking for with, because I still think, when we sort of rank the likely scenarios, I think it's the House is going to stay in Democratic hands. In fact, at this point, I would say that Democrats are likely to pick up between 10 and 15 seats, perhaps. The presidential race, we see that is still lean Biden. And then the Senate is sort of the Republican sort of last firewall attempt. And so do they want to make this argument that, okay, there needs to be a check on a likely Biden administration? We've seen some senators like Tom Tillis begin to make that argument outright. And if we continue to see that in the coming weeks, that tells you about what the numbers people are seeing internally as well.
I want to come back to the Senate in a little bit. Because I think there's just so many interesting dynamics across the country there. But let's return to the presidential for a moment. Scott, the general conversation oftentimes, as we mentioned earlier, kind of revolves around polling, right? And the head-to-head matchup between Biden and Trump at this point does not look dissimilar at first glance from the head-to-head matchup between Clinton and Trump 4 years ago at this point in time.
Yep.
Right? So putting on your Republican hat, maybe you can tell us where it's similar and where it is dissimilar at this point.
Sure. I guess I would say at the top line, it is similar where, or at the top line at the national level, you can make the argument similar, maybe a point or two better for Biden than where Clinton was. But to be honest, the national stuff, I don't even really pay attention to anymore because we don't elect our president by national polls. It's not a popular vote. It's electoral. We look at the states. And the one takeaway from the state level polling is it happened about a week ago, where if you look at the battleground states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida, and we assume that the polling error is the same this cycle as it was in 2016, because there's polling error every cycle. It's not the polls are wrong, so there's polling error. If we assume the same polling error in those states from 2016, Joe Biden still wins those states. And so if I were to make a baseball analogy, that's like being up 5 runs. You can give up a grand slam and still be ahead. And so that to me is the line of where uncertainty is and isn't. Now that can certainly move. We can have those polls move back inside that polling error. And certainly a polling error can be bigger in 2020 than it was in 2016. It could also be smaller for that matter. But I think that's the piece I'm looking at that's different from 2016, is if we apply the polling error from 2016 to 2020 in these state level polls, Biden is in a better position than Senator Clinton was in 2016.
Josh, can you build on that a little bit more? What should people be looking at in the data that tells them this is different than 2016, whether it's demographic changes or other changes that you're seeing?
I think it's really important to recognize this is a really, really close race. And there's nothing in the data to suggest that it's anything other than that. As Scott mentioned, it's about the race to 270 when you talk about the presidential election, and how you get to 270 matters. Certainly what you can see when you look at aggregated publicly available polling is that Joe Biden right now has more available paths to 270 than Donald Trump does, but you only need the one. And so just to highlight a couple of things to your question, Mo, I've been really encouraged by some of the early data that's come in from those states that do tabulate as they receive either in-person early vote or vote by mail ballots. And you see new voters voting at rates, at least for Democrats, much higher than is previously the case. In the state of Florida, both Republicans and Democrats, new registrants, are voting at higher levels. And that's encouraging for our democracy, let alone the race in general. You also see generally lower propensity voters also showing up in higher rates. But one would imagine that you're going to have a lot of enthusiasm at the beginning. It's opening gates, if you will, for ballot requests and in-person early voting. Where I think we're going to have to look quite closely is how's that sustained and what does that look like? So when we talk about Florida just started early voting in some counties today. That'll be the first chance to really compare vote by mail to in person. And we know that Democrats, both because it's self-reported, but is also the historic norm, plan to vote at much, much higher rates by mail this cycle and generally, as I mentioned. Let's see if that trend in fact holds, because what you can't model or forecast in any way, shape, or form is the role that Donald Trump's misinformation and narrative around illegitimacy of vote by mail and the voting process in general, and the role that has in affecting turnout, both among his supporters, who you would imagine then wait until election day to vote in person, and those who are afraid about casting their ballot early.
Let me stick with you for a moment. And before I ask my next question, just a reminder to members of the Georgetown community, you can begin submitting your questions now. Just click on the Q&A tab and submit your question, and we will get to you soon. You started to allude to this a little bit, Josh, and that's sort of the difference this time because of sort of the sheer number of people who will be voting not in person on election day, right? Whether it is the early in-person voting or vote by mail. And that's going to happen in unprecedented numbers. Historically, if I'm not mistaken, Republicans have tended to do better on sort of election day in person. Democrats have historically done better before, in voting before the election, which creates a potential really interesting dynamic that you have written about or talked about, where the sort of where we are at the end of the night on election day might show a Republican surge or Trump leading, but we won't know for sure until after election day, when all those early votes are counted. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of how that plays into the likely scenarios?
So when you consider that almost 2/3 of Democrats have suggested that they plan to vote by mail, again, self-reported, but they are self-reporting that they plan to vote by mail. And Republicans have almost the inverse, in fact, even lower numbers of self-reporting that they're going to vote by mail. One would expect that you can find yourself in a scenario that when the machine counts are done, which let's remember, machine counts happen by and large very quickly. When you've got your prognosticators on cable news the evening of November 3rd, they're going to be showing a country that is more red than is likely to be the case once all of the votes have been tallied. There are some states like Florida that will tally progressively as they receive. And so in the state of Florida, 2.5 million votes have been cast as of today. We know that those are objective facts, but there are plenty of other states that don't count in that way. And in fact, there are a number of key states that don't actually count a single absentee ballot until election day. And so in states like that, you're really going to have a skewed result if you're just looking at the absolute numbers being reported by a Secretary of State. And so we term it the red mirage. It's this notion of this miscued performance and misalignment. One of the interesting things, we started talking about it several months ago, has in fact been a narrative now around why it is important for Democrats to consider putting on their masks, bringing hand sanitizer, and going and voting in person when they have the early vote opportunity. That's real. That's material, right? The tabulation happens fast for those in-person votes as well, and it helps counteract a bit of a narrative, which in a normal democratic process, it is what it is, and we can be patient. But I think we've seen recent examples in the state of New York, for example, where it took an extremely long time to settle a congressional race because it took so long to count absentee ballots. And right now we have a president who's been quite clear of his disdain for the process, and therefore a deep desire to declare victory early and to suggest that any variation in the numbers thereafter is malfeasance.
Scott, I want to ask you one more question, then I want to turn our attention to the Senate. Josh kind of talked briefly earlier about sort of where Biden is sort of showing strength and feeling good. If you were advising the Trump campaign at this point, what is their most likely path to getting to 270?
Their most likely path, both, I'll tell you, qualitative and quantitative, is Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio. And then that gets them started. That's the foundation to then go win Pennsylvania or one of the other two other Midwestern belt states. But there isn't a single scenario, I think. I am sure there's at least I take that back. There's a few scenarios. But the most likely scenario is the president's got to win Florida, and he's got to keep North Carolina, and he can't give up Ohio.
So he's got to sweep all three of those to even be in the game. Is what you're saying.
To be in the game. Doesn't win him the game, but in the game. Which is interesting when you look at just the TV reservations that have gone on and gone off in the last 24 hours, which is, the old school tea leaves of how to read what these campaigns think. Money being moved in and around Ohio, the president being outspent in Florida. It really goes to show kind of where they're thinking of spending their money. You can see where some of the rallies are going. So obviously some of the rallies are in places like North Carolina and Florida, but spending time in Minnesota and Iowa. Iowa's another one. If we're talking about Iowa for the president, he's got to win that. But especially since he won the last time, but spending some time there, it's a tough path. It's not undoable, but it starts with Florida, North Carolina, and keeping Ohio.
Jessica, let's talk about the Senate for a little bit. You sort of began to lay out sort of what you think the map looks like to potentially flip control to the Democrats or retain control for the Republicans. Can we start by focusing, because there's, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, there seems to be at least three top tier Senate races that sort of overlap with battleground presidential, right? Iowa, North Carolina, Arizona. I guess you could add the 2 seats in Georgia as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
So
talk about that. Yeah, that overlap a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think what is interesting in really all of those states is that I think, except for Georgia, that we are seeing Republican candidates run behind Trump in these states. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that even if they caught up to Trump's margin that they are going to win, because in our electoral ratings at Cook, we rate Arizona as lean Democrat. We have both Georgia and Iowa and North Carolina still in toss-up, but there is sort of I think this is why Republican incumbents are in sort of this year, they're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Is there's still some skepticism among sort of that Trump base that they have not been loyal enough on, the few times that they have dared to sort of criticize or distance their president, and they're not winning over independents either. And President Trump has not made that easy. You know, if you dare to cross him, he tweeted out against Susan Collins last week after she broke with him on Justice Barrett's nomination. And that's a seat that they really have to win. Well, I mean, it's probably the third seat most likely to fall, but it's not one that they want to be losing, especially with a longtime incumbent like that. So, but I still think that, you know, in another state that I would say is a battleground race where Republicans would like to be doing better is one of the only two other offensive opportunities that Republicans have, and that's in Michigan.
Yeah.
You have Gary Peters, that was the only Democrat elected in that wave year of 2014 when Republicans took back the Senate. And John James, African-American Republican Army veteran, is a very strong candidate. He is just neck and neck with Gary Peters, and Peters has lagged behind Joe Biden there. But again, you know, as Scott was talking about where we sort of see the averages in those Midwestern states, if Trump is losing it by 7 points or so, and even if we adjust a few points, we don't see that these incumbents are typically able to outrun the top of the ticket by, especially Republicans, by more than a few points. For instance, I looked at the 2016 numbers, which in 2016, every single Senate race broke the same way that the presidential election did. And on average, they can only outperform the president by almost 3 points. But if we look at just the competitive races that we rated back then as toss-up or lean, it was about 1.2 points. So these races run very close to the presidential results. And again, Georgia, that's really unique circumstances, because I think these elections with two races there could go to, I think both are probably going to go to a runoff on January 5th. You have the regular election there between David Perdue and Jon Ossoff. And then the special election where you have appointed Senator Kelly Loeffler has been pulled to the right by Doug Collins' entrance in that jungle primary, allowing Raphael Warnock, the African-American pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, to come out to a lead there. And again, Loeffler, she was, and has far to the right that she is, you know, appealing to QAnon it's for endorsements and different things, and running ads about how she is as conservative as Attila the Hun, or more conservative than Attila the Hun. And so Georgia has a rule where if no candidate gets above 50% in either race, then that goes to a runoff. So I think it's well over 50% chance right now that both of those races will go to a January 5th, 2021 runoff. And that will control of the Senate come down to those two seats, or could that determine how large a Democratic majority comes? I will say, you know, Republican pollsters that I've talked to, especially in the past few weeks, their sort of best case scenario right now is holding Democrats to maybe a 51-49 margin. I think the median, if I sort of had to guess right now, would be 53-47. We have 7 seats currently in our toss-up category. When we look at that historically, those toss-up races typically break one way or the other by about 70 to 80% of the time. And typically the party that is having the better night. So if it is looking like it'll be a better night for Democrats, I think we'll see a lot of those races, friends, in Montana, possibly even South Carolina, break the same way. And, you know, so I think, again, maybe it's more in that Georgia about just keeping them from a 55 seat majority or something.
Mo, I was going to say,
ahead,
just one question for Jessica. We're huge fans at Optimist of the Cook Political, so that I promised the guys I'd ask you this question.
Yeah.
If Jamie Harrison wins in South Carolina, do you think that is number 52, 53, 54, 55 for the Democrats on election night or election month and a half?
I think it's seat 55. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's where we get to. I think of our toss-ups, I still think that's the hardest one. And
harder than Iowa.
It's hard. Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I rank I think of our toss-ups, I would rank North Carolina, Iowa, then perhaps either both Georgia seats, then Montana, and then I think South Carolina is still harder because that's a less elastic state too.
Yeah.
And you have Democrats that have a ceiling in a place like South Carolina. And that's why I think you see Harrison hitting 47, maybe 48% in polls. And he's using some of that $57 million that he raised to promote the Constitution Party candidate, who has since dropped out of the race, endorsed Lindsey Graham, and was essentially running not a campaign at all even before that. But he wants these people to lodge a protest vote against Graham. They may not vote for him, but if that Bill Bledsoe can get 3-4% of the vote, then that's a winning path to him. And we've seen this happen before in races in Montana and South Dakota. This is nothing
Alaska,
new.
all of them.
Exactly, Alaska as well. It's nothing new, really.
Yeah. No, we had to ask. It was interesting.
This may be a somewhat redundant question, but like I remember election night 2016, watching the returns come in. And I think the moment it really hit me that the Electoral College was going to go to Trump was when they called the Wisconsin Senate race, right? Which was not supposed to go the Republicans' way. And Ron Johnson actually won it, or it was called much, much earlier in the night in that Senate race than the state was called in the presidential. But it was just pretty clear that if they were calling Ron Johnson at that point, it was going to be really hard for the state to go. I'm wondering, are there states like that? Are there Senate races like that on election night, as we're watching, if the Senate race is called early in the night, that tells us, that gives us some tea leaves on how the presidential breaks. And this is for all of you.
I mean, I think Iowa could be one of those because you see Joni Ernst running pretty, 4 points or so behind the president. Greenfield's running ahead of Biden there. That could give us an idea. I mean, Texas is another one to watch where, there's so many competitive House races there. We have John Cornyn now and lean Republican. That could certainly be one. And things. I mean, like I said, I think Arizona and Colorado at this point, I give those to the Democrats in my head. But I would look at Iowa, and again, Georgia, I think would typically be a good indicator of things, but they have the runoff rule that I think is just going to throw everything haywire.
Yeah, just to echo, it's funny. Our firm did Ron Johnson in 2016. I remember having to get on the phone the Sunday night before the election to explain to them that we had a 3,500 sample out of the state that had him ahead, and kind of got laughed off the phone call a little bit. And so it just tells you how surprised we were. And that state for us this year has got to be Iowa or North Carolina, tied for both of those. If those get called before midnight and they're substantial wins, which is how they're going to get called before midnight, if they're pretty substantial, you kind of know how the night's going to go.
Absolutely.
Josh, anything other than those states?
I would just add that, there are things like Florida that matter because they tally, like I said, progressively. And so they're going to come out on the East Coast with an early result, and that's going to impact how folks on the West Coast approach their activity. And,
I just a note on Florida there that I just find it incredibly ironic that after given, the 2000 debacle, that Florida could be the one that they've gotten their act together. They could show us how things are going early on election night. And as Scott said, it's really hard to see a path there for Trump to 270 if he doesn't win Florida. So I think that's a big tell. Doesn't have a Senate race this cycle. It will have next cycle with Marco Rubio. But yeah, Florida, man, you've redeemed yourself in 2 decades.
One fun stat about Florida and calling elections, if you look at the last 5 statewides, only 2 of the 5 last statewides were called before 2 a.m. And the 2 times that Rick Scott won statewide, he won with less than 70,000 votes.
Yeah.
And so if you think about that, 10, 11 million people voting in Florida, Rick Scott won it 2 times in a row with less than 70,000 votes. Everyone's looking at this one closely. I'm sure we're all going to be looking at West Palm Beach come Wednesday morning, which is usually one of those counties that's late. It's crazy how close Florida would be.
I mean, I think the senior vote there in Florida is so important too. And I think that's one thing, because that's, I think, one of the biggest changes that we have seen, from the 2016 exit polls, where Trump won seniors by 7 in those exit polls over 65. And in the last Fox poll, Biden was winning them by 2. And with Florida's older vote, I think, you look there to some of the votes coming out around the villages and different things too. If those counties are not big wins for Trump, I think he could be in real trouble.
Well, just building on that, Jessica, it's just such a rapidly diversifying state, and it starts looking more and more like the nation in general. So to your question, Mo, of is it a bellwether, is it not? The very fact is you can kind of slice and dice some of the data in Florida, and it's going to be, to my mind, one of the most obvious and ultimate tells for the race overall, the set of races overall.
Yeah. Okay, I've got so many questions that this conversation just keeps building up, but I want to, and so I reserve moderators' right to interject with some of them later. But let's start taking some of the questions from members of the Georgetown community. When I call your name, you'll be on camera. Introduce yourself, who you are, your Georgetown affiliation, and where you're zooming in from before you ask your question. So let's start with our first questioner, Daniel.
Hi, thank you. I'm Daniel. I'm currently a graduate student at the School of Foreign Service, and I'm zooming in here from Washington, D.C. My question is, do you believe Democrats are poised to regain any state legislative chambers that will assist them in redistricting come next year? And if so, which ones in particular?
The two are off the top of my head that are interesting, and I admittedly don't pay attention to it as much as the other ones, would be looking at West Virginia and looking at Florida. I'm sure there's more than those, but those are two bigger ones. Lots of money being spent from independent expenditures and things like that. And as you're pointing out, these state legislatures are ready to draw the lines in some of these states. There's a really great website called CN Analysis, run by a guy out of Virginia named Chaz Honeycomb. He does state legislative races for all 6,000 seats. I would go check that out. Whatever Chaz says is probably going to be a pretty good resource.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
I'll just add, I'm curious about South Carolina this cycle. It's such a dynamic race that turnout is all but certainly going to be high, and could get interesting.
North Carolina, I think the state Senate there is certainly in play as well. I would also watch the Arizona House and the New Hampshire Senate that seem to be trending a little bit more toward Democrats. And, I think Texas too, they have a chance to flip the state house there too. I think it's still a little bit harder in a way, but that's sort of, where we are seeing. It's interesting because Texas has sort of been a trickle up state this cycle. You have Beto O'Rourke that is pouring a lot of money and energy into a lot of those state legislative districts that also overlap with the congressional races that we see increasingly coming on board that then could also help MJ Hagar at the Senate race, who she's been underfunded compared to some of these candidates. And then Biden is now sort of putting some money into Texas. Like, does that make that one closer than we would think too? So I think Texas up and down is an interesting case there. And of course, Texas is no stranger to redistricting battles over the past few decades.
All right, thanks for the question, Daniel. Before we go to the next student question, let me actually take a step back and ask you guys. I mean, there was a lot of criticism, right, last time, not just of the pollings, but even those who did forecasting. Not you, Josh. I know you don't like the forecasting. But a lot of it is because I think the models were off, right? These models that people build in order to do their analysis oftentimes assumes the electorate is going to look a certain way. And I think what caught a lot of people off guard last time, not everybody, but caught a lot of people off guard. A lot of the models didn't expect white rural vote to be as high as it was, for example, right? White rural male vote specifically to be as large as it was last time. And so I'm wondering how you sort of take those lessons from election to election and how you rebuild a model without really being able to know who's going to turn out.
In the defense of modelers, I guess I would push back on the premise a little bit. I actually wrote a piece for this for UVA on it. If you look, let's take 538, which is the most popular and visible model out there. The beauty about statistics is you never have to be certain. And so the 538 model, the Sunday before the election, gave Donald Trump a 29% chance of winning, which is roughly 1 in 3 chance. 1 in 3 happens 1 in 3 times. Right. And so I would say, at the risk of offending a lot of people listening to this, I don't necessarily think the models are wrong. I think the interpretation of the models are wrong, because most people who read these things look at them for a binary answer. yes or no, win or lose. And in reality, a model isn't designed for that. A model is designed to give someone a probability. At the end of the day, if I present someone with a probability of you can pick the 70% chance thing or you can pick the 30% chance thing, what are you going to take? Most people are going to take the 70% every single time, realizing that 1 in 3 times they're not going to get it. Now, when I put some narrative around it, 70% chance Hillary Clinton, 30% chance Donald Trump, all of a sudden people bring emotion into the math of it all, which is where I think a lot of this goes wrong. The other thing is in polling and things like that. I talked about polling error earlier. Polling error is a thing. It will be a thing this year. It was a thing last cycle. It was a thing 70 years ago when people started using in politics. And so understanding how to read these things, margin of error, how it all works, I think is helpful. Now, look, the model that I work on for Optimists that's public from Decision Desk HQ has a 12-point spread from 538, has a 20-point spread from 538 on the Senate side. So even models don't necessarily agree on everything, but they're good when used properly and interpreted properly. I think hopefully everyone at Georgetown, if you're at the, getting your degree there, I know they're incorporating stats and how to read all these types of things. I think that's important when contextualizing these things. Are they wrong? All models are wrong. It's just how you use them. And I think the public's a lot better at it. And you got to give credit to Nate Silver for that. Just keep talking about it and getting in the news. We're a lot more astute at how we interpret these things than we were, say, in 2012 or 2008.
We have a really cool tool on our site that I'd point people to. If you go to cookpolitical.com/swingometer, that my colleague David Wasserman helped develop with some other college students, actually. And it will give you, if you look at just the demographic shifts in the country since 2016, and if the same turnout levels apply to that, then Joe Biden would be winning with 307 electoral votes to 231 for Donald Trump. But you can actually move that. So let's say you do think that more white non-college voters are going to turn out. You can, which percent of the share. So you can play with that and it'll show you which states would move, which, where do you get to, maybe tying it up to 270 or 269 tie. So that's a free tool that we have there in conjunction with NBC News as well. So you can go to that and it breaks down more of the demographic shifts there. You can play around with that for a long time, actually. And then you can actually share your prediction on social media as well.
I would just add, though, that one of the a legendary Democratic analyst, modeler, early on said to me, you'd be really shocked in politics how few folks do math. And that's certainly been, he was right. And I hate to say it, but I want to say that out loud for the Georgetown community, because I think it is one of the challenges that exist. A lot of the folks who build models and produce analysis are doing it for political strategists and stakeholders who want absolute truths to be on the other side of that model. And as Scott explained, that's simply not the case. It's statistics. And it's trying to apply a bit of predictability. So one of the approaches that we like at Hawkfish a lot is to not try to produce a single source of truth, but rather to have a number of pieces of data that you bring forth so that you can actually make an informed decision as a political stakeholder. And some of that is you find in digital data and engagement data, and really understanding how the body politic is reacting in the same way where polling is, this self-reported insight that I discussed a bit earlier. And I'd like to believe that while we're kind of just touching the beginnings of that, it ends up becoming an important way to start getting better and better at building more accurate scenarios. And I just won't use that word, forecasting. And I think that we'll see more and more of it in the future, which would be quite productive.
So big takeaway for the audience here. These models, these forecasts, these analysis are not predictive. Even the ones that start election night, they are not predictive, right? They are, what I'm hearing from all of you is all they are doing is saying, here's the probability of certain things happening if certain things happen to get you there, right? Okay. All right, let's go to our next question. Christina.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here once again. Christina Kola from the EMPL program here at McCourt. I actually have two questions. And the first one is for you, Jessica. With respect to the Arizona race between Martha McSally and Mark Kelly, if the Democrats can successfully push off the SCOTUS vote, how could that affect the races in other states? How could that potentially affect the other states? And for all of you, do you think there's a possibility of the president withdrawing the nomination, the SCOTUS nomination, in favor of a more robust stimulus package at this point, because he knows he needs the Senate on board with him, and they have what they needed, which was the SCOTUS nomination? So
I'll take first crack at that part first and the second question. There is, actually right before Ginsburg's death, I got a call from an Arizona reporter that asked me about this very scenario. And I wasn't even thinking about, a Supreme Court vacancy. I was thinking about, some sort of relief package or something down the line, or things that they might try to push through in a lame duck session. And then the day that published, then we got that, that unfortunate news about Justice Ginsburg. I think it would have been a lot more. In short, it did seem as though, because this is a special election, that if the votes were counted and certified by the end of November, then Mark Kelly, if he beats Martha McSally, would be able to be sworn in early and be there for the lame duck session. I think that would have mattered a lot more, certainly, if you'd have gotten one more Republican to break. But since it does look like right now it's just Collins and Murkowski, that sort of became a moot scenario. And listen, they're moving ahead. They've held the hearings. They're going to hold a vote this week. I mean, they're moving, steamrolling ahead. And, Mitch McConnell has been so focused on judicial nominations throughout this that is going to be, I think, the lasting legacy of the Trump presidency, is the way that they have been able to remake the federal judiciary. And the Supreme Court is sort of the crown on top of that he would get three seats, throughout his, if he is just held to a 4-year term. Of course, Democrats are going to say 2 of those seats should not have happened under his watch necessarily, but you could even make the case that I've heard sort of Republicans muse about this, that, well, they have the Supreme Court. They've gotten the Supreme Court seat. What motivation do they have to sort of reelect Trump now? And I think that's why you aren't really maybe seeing those numbers move as much. We've ultimately, I think, seen it be a much bigger motivator for Democrat money really pouring in that can make a late breaking impact in some of these races. Because also remember, candidate dollars go a lot further than outside money dollars when you're talking about ad buys, because candidates get the lower rate than super PACs do. And then I think finally, I think that, Republicans, and when I was talking with them, in the days after Ginsburg's death, they really sort of saw this as a way to sort of at least change the conversation beyond COVID. But any chance of that happening evaporated with that debate performance following by the president himself getting COVID. And then in turn, I think not really emerging from what was, I think, a good opportunity to appear empathetic to the plight of, hundreds of thousands of Americans that have unfortunately lost loved ones and different things too. So, I'm not sure that that's really going to be a motivating factor necessarily.
So thanks for the question, Christina. Let me, though, build on that and sort of go a little bit more broad. I mean, one of the things that's been really remarkable to me looking at the race, at least from the ivory tower of academia that I'm in, has been how remarkably static it has been, at least sort of at the polling level, right? Like, you just have not seen much movement in the polls. That people seem to they've known since the spring how they were going to vote. There wasn't a ton of uncertainty. So here's a 2-part question. 1, is that what the rest of the data shows? And 2, if so, does that mean heading into these final weeks that it is just a turnout game, or is there still room for people to change their minds, or for there to be some level of successful persuasion by either campaign?
When we've been looking at the presidential race, that you're right, that data has remained very static. And I think that's one thing that's been really shocking, is that for all of these ups and downs of the past few months, is that I think it was sort of a 6, 7, 8 point Biden lead. We saw that widen a little bit, I think, again, after that first debate, because I think there were some small persuadable voters there that Trump could have gotten, but I think his debate performance turned off a lot of women, especially. I think Frank Luntz is going to hold another focus group after this debate, and I'd really encourage you to try to tune in to watch. They're really revealing. One woman repeatedly after it said Trump was acting like a crackhead, which I've never a word that I've heard to describe the president of the United States in a focus group before. But another sort of key point we look at is where the president's approval rating is. Like there have just been baked in opinions of him since the very beginning, that you have the people that are incredibly loyal with him that are never going to leave him, and you have the people that are going to be against him. He's the first president in modern history that has never surpassed 50% in the Gallup approval ratings. And where we look at where he is, when we look at other presidents, at this juncture, right before Election Day, he's polling a lot closer to where Jimmy Carter was and where George H.W. Bush were, rather than President Obama, George W. Bush, Reagan were heading into, where they were far above 50%. He isn't as low as the first Bush and Carter was, because again, I think we just see a very polarized electorate, and there are, I think, just a smaller universe of those swing voters. But I do think that, especially with the way Trump has handled the pandemic and things, I think he's just turned off some of those voters that may have been willing to give him another shot, especially because they liked where he was on the economy. I mean, that's the one thing that he still had going for him, I think, before the pandemic. And all of this, I think, has kind of erased that advantage he once had.
One thing to add to what Jessica was saying is I think this is the first election, I hesitate to say in the history of elections, but certainly in the last 50 years, in the key battleground states, we're looking at the presidential. So think Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maine, Arizona. We're going to have between 40 and 75% of every single vote eventually cast before Election Day. So in Florida, we're projecting 10 to 11 million total voters. We think by Election Day, between 7 and 8 million have already voted. And so when you look at the calendar, we're 15 days out, seems like a lifetime. Every single day that goes by where these polls are stable is another day in which there is one less voter on the table for these candidates to fight over. And I think that's something that I'm not telling you anything that both candidates' campaigns don't know. I know for a fact that the Trump campaign is looking at this data and has lots more people than just me looking at it. They are very aware of this. I think the Biden campaign's very aware of this. And I think that's the biggest thing, is stability is not necessarily a good thing given the accelerated vote by mail.
I'd offer just one more insight, though, of something that we have seen change quite consistently. And that is, if you were just horse race it, right, Donald Trump support, Joe Biden support, what's most interesting about the Joe supporter was just how much of it was anti-Trump. But not pro-Joe. And that has now changed over time as more and more of the electorate has come to understand what Joe represents and stands for. You have more folks who are saying, no, I am in fact pro-Joe Biden. And so that's been an interesting point of movement, particularly when this becomes a turnout game. So Florida being the state that so tight every single cycle of these last couple, turnout's going to be everything, and we want to, really try to understand what is going to motivate that voter. And if they're there as an anti-Trump voter, and Trump has a good last couple of days, they might very well stay home. They've got to be motivated by an interest in Joe Biden.
So we're getting close to the end of our time. I want to try to sneak a couple of last questions in. One of the big arguments we've got right now going on between the two sides is, sadly, around the legitimacy of the election, right? With some of the president's supporters making the argument that the vote by mail system is flawed. And so really we should, whoever is leading on election night should be declared the victor. I'm oversimplifying, right? But that's sort of one argument. And the other being sort of a concerted effort by the other side to say, no, it is very, very, very unlikely that we will know by the end of election night who the next president of the United States is. I'm wondering if you all can weigh in, on sort of what you think when we might know something. Well,
I guess I'll start with my Republican hat on. I would say this is, I understand what the president's saying, but having worked with I've worked with Ginsburg, I've worked with a lot of the lawyers who are on the president's team in and around this stuff. I guess I might be speaking out of turn. No serious person in Republican operative politics thinks that vote by mail is wrought with massive voter fraud. I understand what we read and we get accused of, but the operatives that I work with and been working with for 15 years, we understand. We may disagree on a few things, but no one thinks there are millions of votes being cast like that. How that translates into election calling, if I were to put on my decision desk hat, I lead up the team that calls it for Decision Desk, one of the three major agencies out there that does it with the Associated Press and Edison. And one of the scenarios, to steal a term from Josh, that we're looking at is a state like Pennsylvania that is going through current litigation about how and when they can open up all these absentee ballots that they're getting and when they can count it. It is very likely that Pennsylvania, around midnight on election night, the president will be leading by high single digits, if not double digits. And Pennsylvania, as the law currently stands at 6:26 on Monday, right now, they can still accept ballots for the next 3 days. And we know, based on public data, and I can tell you from private data, Democrats are voting more by absentee in Pennsylvania than otherwise. And so it's not an inconceivable scenario that in the state of Pennsylvania, the president is winning by 7, 8, 9 points on election night, and over the course of the next 72, if not 96 hours, slowly gives away his lead as more Democratic votes come in. That can be a huge deal when you're calling the race for a network like CNN or Fox. I know my colleagues who call over there, that's something we talk about, because no one wants to be, no network wants to necessarily be out in front of the other one, especially given the tone and tenor of this race. And so I think those are the types of things we're looking at. Now, Pennsylvania gets real important if the president wins, Florida or North Carolina, two states that we think have a possibility of knowing on election night or early Wednesday. Possibility, not a guarantee. But these are some of the scenarios, folks who are calling the race at NBC and CNN, and for what it's worth, New York Times and Washington Post do not take the AP calls. They are going to have different race call teams, and I think that's something that's going to be everyone's looking at. And I don't think it's an overblown fear. And I don't think it's an overblown fear simply because all these rules are going around and everyone's going to be overly cautious. The worst thing in the world, I think, and I can say this from the other networks, is no one wants MSNBC calling it, Fox not calling it, the New York Times calling it, the Washington Post not calling it. I'm not saying it's a cabal. I'm just saying we're all very aware on the misinformation and how these things can get away from itself.
Speaking to what Scott said about the mail-in voting, I've talked with Republican senators that are not happy with the way that the president has sort of trashed this voting, because they know that they need to get their supporters to vote out for this, especially older voters. And these Senate races could be decided by just a few thousand votes. That can make a huge difference. That they, I think, are pushing this privately and in some of their own mailings and stuff too. And they're not happy with the way he talks about it and tries to discredit it again, because there are such essentially non-existent data when you look at all of the votes that shows that there is any iota of widespread fraud. Yes, there are mistakes that happen because there is human error and there are computer errors, but no sort of big doomsday scenario plot that is trying to undercut this at all. And again, I think that it could make a difference in some of these Senate races. And again, we may not know the full count of some of these Senate races for a few days either. Take away Georgia in that scenario and things too. But I think Republican senators would be feeling a lot better had the president not sort of tried to throw this whole, broad way of voting amidst a pandemic under the bus.
Just as a data point, we recently asked folks, why do they, when they tell us that they intend to vote in person, we ask them why. More than 50% say because they believe that the process is fraudulent and their vote might not count unless they show up on election day and vote. That's the only method that should count. That's a really wild bit to hear, and that's, by the way, cross-partisan. Only a third of Floridians who plan to vote in person are doing so because it's a preference. The rest are doing it out of concern.
So just sort of round robin to close out that question, is the probability higher that we will know by Wednesday morning, or higher that we won't know until some point past Wednesday morning who's won the election? I'm trying to ask this question.
Oh, I offer there's no chance we know Wednesday morning. Unless there's a really incredible result.
It sounds an awful lot like in forecast, Josh.
Yeah.
Anyone disagree with that?
No, I don't think we disagree because we're the modelers. We have a quantitative look at that. We have at about a 1 to 2% chance that you'll be able to call the race for election night, for Donald Trump election night, defined as by 2 a.m. Wednesday. We have it at about a 10 to 20% chance that you'll be able to call it for Biden on election night. That's 2 a.m. Wednesday. And the remaining percent is sometime in the next month.
All right. So we're coming towards the end of our time. So I just want to ask one last question. And that is, we've got a lot of really smart people who are watching tonight, who are going to be glued to their television sets all the way up until 2 a.m. to see if Scott's right. As if you were to give advice to someone who's politically interested as to what they should actually be watching for throughout election night, right? Everyone, I know I'm going to have like my TV on and I'm going to have my iPad open. And I'm going to be surfing around different websites and different, Secretary of State, Board of Election sites. What am I looking for? What should I be watching to give me some sense as to how the night's really going?
I'm unhappy I'm going to be here at home because I hate not being in a newsroom on election night. I'm still trying to adjust my mind to that. It's another, unfortunate thing of the pandemic, but, I'm going to be looking at these modelers too. We rely on them. I think, what Scott and them have done there at Decision Desk has been an excellent resource because they're often getting data faster than we see it on Secretary of State sites being reported. So I'm really thankful for that we have more avenues to report it at. Typically we would be behind, we at Cook work with the NBC Decision Desk, but this year, unfortunately, because of social distancing and they cut back, so only one of us will be there and things. So I, won't get as big of a peek behind the curtain as I look. So, since I'm not going to be seeing the same data that I normally would be, I'm going to be looking to folks like that, again, when these networks call it, because I think they're right. You've got, especially, again, after the 2000 debacle, I think that it's only heightened this time because you have a president that has tried to undercut sort of the veracity of these things and tried to throw some of this into doubt. That I do think that, in talking with other colleagues and things that are going to be working on this, that there is just, I think, a real sense of, democratic, not little d democratic responsibility to try to get this right and to get the best information out there, and you don't hear senators, you don't hear people like Mitch McConnell trying to undercut this, that they are the ones saying, listen, we will accept the results of the election. And I think that's just important guardrails of democracy that we can try to look at during this time.
Yeah, I think Jessica nailed it. For me, it's all about the macro. Are we going to have the networks and the respected individuals who tend to be on TV on election night recognize the gravity of the situation they find themselves in and avoid the sort of cheap and easy route of just looking at machine tallies and saying, oh, this is generally how it's going. Well, we'll see what happens. But instead recognize that the president has put our democracy at stake. And so handling the circumstance with the gravity that's required is going to be everything. That's sort of first and foremost. And I'd offer on maybe a more lighthearted note, it's not going to be, a political junkie's favorite night because it's going to be dragged on, but it's sure going to be a data nerd's favorite night because, really going in and doing those deeper cuts than folks are used to doing, looking at Pennsylvania and recognizing that the areas around Philly just count slower than everywhere else, but that matters a lot. Those moments are, I don't know, I guess that's like where you get your jollies amidst all this, just how serious the situation is.
Yeah, I would say to give people something specific to look at, wait for multiple networks or multiple outlets, including our own, to call Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio, which I think will be in the first 24 hours of election night, so sometime Wednesday. But one thing is, if this is your first or your 10th election night, take everything with a grain of salt. Don't tee into some Twitter account or some report of missing ballots. Like most things, election night is like an emergency. The first news is not always the right news, especially on Twitter, especially on social media. I can't wait to get a call from some brand new person telling me they found another 1 million ballots in Maricopa County, and that's the reason why. Like, these things happen. Just take a breath. It'll all get sorted out. My favorite fact to tell everyone is most states have 30 days before they release the official tally. Everything you get on election night is unofficial. States take 30 days to do this. We can all take a breath.
Take a breath. That sounds like the perfect note to end on. Josh, Scott, Jessica, thank you so much for helping us make sense of all of this tonight, and giving us maybe a little bit of guidance on what we should be looking at over the next couple of weeks. And we'll all be. I'm going to try to stay off Twitter on election night, but maybe I'll stay on and just follow the three of you, and that's it. To those of you, to the audience, thank you so much for tuning in, sharing part of your night with us. And as I tend to close these things out, however you're going to vote, whether it's in person or whether it is early, make sure you know your plan. Make sure you know your deadlines. Make sure you know how you're going to vote, when you're going to vote, and then make sure you vote. So with that, thanks so much, and stay tuned for the next GU Politics Forum event. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.